Tonight's reading is from James, verse 1. 1, 2, 6, 7. There we go, James. Cool. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. To the 12 tribes scattered among the nations, greetings. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work in you, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wildflower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant. Its blossom falls and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away, even while they go about their business. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because, having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. Thanks be to God.
Thanks, Dom. So when I was at school, one of the things that we were required to do if you were in any of the first team sports was you were required to go to do fitness. And it was a morning and an afternoon that you'd have to go do it. And I was in a couple of the teams, and I found a way every single week to get out of it. When I was playing hockey, I was a goalkeeper, so I'd make the excuse, well, goalkeepers don't need to move that much. And cricket, I'd say, no, I was practicing something else. I'd just find ways, as often as I could, to get out of any sort of physical activity. Now, when we got to the matches, though, I was ready. I wanted to go, and I'd give my best. And for some of the matches, it was fine. It wasn't too difficult, but every now and then we'd play a match which was a little bit more strenuous, a little bit harder. And I would feel the problem that was me not being fit for that match. I'd feel it that whole match. And I'd be saying to myself, oh, if I just put some effort in the week, it would be easier now. In the same way, as we come to this passage, I think sometimes we have not put the effort in the hard times or in the difficult things that are meant there to train us and help us, so that when we get into the difficulties and the real hardships of life, we're not fully prepared. For the other aspects of life, we might be able to go through it. But when real hard times hit, because we haven't really applied ourselves well, it makes those times that much more difficult. And when it comes to faith, it becomes even more so. It becomes this time in which we go, well, is God really here? Will he really help me out? Because it really doesn't feel like God is with me right now. And so as we come to this text in which James, as Lyle has given us, this practical faith, as he deals with some practicalities of trials and temptations that we go through, part of it doesn't sit well with us. In fact, as I prepared for the sermon and as we will now listen to it, it's about as comfortable as a mallet. It's not something that you're going to walk away from going, that just felt great. And I think it's important that it's not. Because in the world right now, and even within Christianity, there's this, and excuse my language here, trash being spoken about come to Christ and everything will be fine. It'll be good. In fact, there are some teachers who will go and preach the idea that when you come to Christ, riches are just around the corner. health is going to be perfect if you just believe enough. And if you're going through hardships, that's because you're not believing enough. But then you come to the book of James, and James completely speaks against it. He tells us quite clearly, trials are coming. And he is going to put it in such a way to say that God uses those trials to make us better. So let's grapple with that this morning. Because like my match, I imagine all of us want to be prepared for this life. We want to be prepared for when that difficult time comes around the corner. And so let's come into our text. James chapter 1 starts with the person who is telling us the story. It says, James, a servant, or in some of your scriptures will say, a bondservant of God. Now, the James that we are speaking about here, many people hold different views. Some people go, this is James, the brother of Jesus Christ. And he head up the Jerusalem church for a while. This is James. Or it's James, one of the main disciples that Jesus had. You remember Peter, John, and James, the top three guys. It could be that James. Or there's another James who is another disciple that we don't really know all that much about, in fact. And so these three different views. Quite a few people will hold to the view that this is James, the brother of Christ, because they believe that James, the disciple, wouldn't have had enough time to write it before his martyrdom. But in either case, what's important is how he describes himself. He describes himself as a bond servant. Now, a bond servant is the idea that I give myself up willingly to be a slave for you. Quite an amazing way to describe yourself. James is not describing himself as either the brother or the disciple or the apostle. No, he describes himself as a willing slave of Jesus Christ. Just for a moment, just consider, how would you describe yourself? And think about how we often do describe ourselves. Hey, Lyle, tell me about you. Well, I do this. I study this. Imagine describing yourself as a bondservant of Christ. You get a strange look, but what a testimony that would be. And we come into the text. He is writing to the 12 tribes. He is writing to the Jewish believers, the Jewish Christians within the nations. And he then speaks to them, and he starts off his passage with, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Now, I'm 40 years old now. I don't think I've ever faced any trial with joy. I don't think it's something I'm excited for. Yes, some suffering is coming my way. Awesome. What James starts with is such a high call. Consider it joy to go through difficulty. Man, I consider it joy when difficulty is no more. That's when it's joyful. Not at the front end of it. But he says, consider it joy whenever you face trials of many kinds. Because, and here's your reasoning, you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. So he understands that there is a result that comes from these trials and temptations. But what are the trials that he could be talking about here? Now, as he is writing to Jewish Christians, some of the trials that they would have been going through, for example, would have been things like employment. You've got to remember, these are a group of people who are living amongst different nations. Now, already they would have been ostracized because they're Jewish. They're not part of this group. They're not part of the Romans or whatever country they are. But now they're being ostracized even more so because they're choosing to believe in Jesus Christ. And so as the community finds out about these people, when they go to look for a job, they don't get one. They have no employment. And so finances start to become an issue. Think about the other problems that they would have had. Family. The family stress amongst a husband and a wife, as the wife or the husband comes to faith in Jesus Christ. Now this other person is going, what are you doing? You're losing employment. You're making our life difficult because of your belief. The struggle that that person would have gone through. They would have also just suffered normal persecution. As the Romans looked at Christians, it was the idea that they were atheists. That's how they looked at Christians, because they chose to believe in only one God, whereas the Romans believed in multiple gods. And so they're like, you deny our gods, we will persecute you. And in some cases, that persecution was merely just verbal, but in other cases, that persecution was actual physical harm. And then the other trials that these people would have gone through that James does speak about is just sometimes trials that they receive out of bad choices. As they live as humans, they make bad choices and they receive the consequences of those choices. And in all cases, James pushes this idea, consider it pure joy when they come. Consider it joy. My kids frequently made bad choices in our household, all the time, as their father does as well. But as a good father, I have to bring consequences to my kids and have to explain to them these consequences. And when I give them the consequences, before they're stubborn and they're like, oh, Dad, we're not that sad. But as soon as they get the consequence, the change of that child. It's, oh, please, Dad, no. But then as they slowly go through that consequence, something shifts and they change. And they remember what they're supposed to do better the next time. That's what James is pushing to in all these ideas. What he is looking for is a testing of your faith. And so what should come out of this? Well, as you look at it in verse 4, it speaks about let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. And this idea in verse 3 of testing your faith or going through a trial of fire, the picture you often have here is of the blacksmith. And so what they would do in silver, the blacksmith, is they would heat up the silver, and as the silver was heated up, there'd be this extra stuff on top that they would then cut off, and then they'd put the silver back into the furnace, and they'd do it again, and they'd do it again, and do it again, until that silver was made perfect. And part of the way in which they would test that perfection is that when they looked at the silver, they needed to see their reflection. That was when they saw that it was perfect. And so in the same way, part of the reason we go through this testing, this idea to be made perfect, or another way in which the Jewish people understood it, whole or complete, is so that ultimately we would reflect the one looking into it. And so who is the one looking into it? It's Christ. As Christ looks in, he wants to see his reflection. And so he cuts off the parts that are harmful to the silver, parts that make the silver cracked and gross, and he cuts them off until he finds that pure, perfect silver. Now, silver has no feelings, but you can catch the concept. As the silver goes through the heat, it's painful. As the silver goes through the cutting, it's painful. But ultimately, it's all for the idea to produce something that is perfect and whole. How do the scriptures understand whole? Well, as the scriptures understand whole, it's the idea that you would be completely human in what that means. The very definition of the word. Human as in the idea of a true image of God. Only one person has actually ever lived that out, and that's Jesus Christ. Because as he was born, he was perfect all the way through to his death. But in the same way for us, the more we look like Jesus, the more we are human, the more we are whole, the more we are who we are supposed to be. You are not meant to be the evil parts of yourself. But how often do we use that as our definition of who we are? We are meant to be whole. We are meant to look different. And so part of why we go through this is that ultimately, so as we become whole, it's to purify our faith. It's to fortify us in patience and to ultimately sanctify my character. So what do I mean by that? The idea, as he speaks a little bit later, so that we would not be people who doubt, but that our faith would be pure. A faith that just believes that God is the one. But in order for that faith to believe, we have to have perseverance, which requires patience. Who here struggles with patience? This is something we can land our hands up for. We struggle with patience, especially in this age. The beauty of Google and now AI is you get answers like this. I'm not that old, but I remember having to, when writing an essay, I'd have to go and find an encyclopedia, open the encyclopedia, look for the details, copy it down, writing, and then write an assignment. The day copy-paste came out was a great day for me, bad day for my teachers. But everything is instant. And so we lack patience. And the worst part about it is we lack patience for character. And so when it comes to building character, to be wiser, to be better, to be stronger, I want it now or not at all. But it requires us to put effort in. My kids have started getting into climbing recently. And so it's quite amazing. We get to go to the rock climbing gym and climb. And the first time they go, it's exciting. You know, you climb up, it's great. But then they start to learn, okay, well, you need to do these different routes. And they start climbing. And then Allegra after a bit, she's like, Dad, my hands are really, really sore. I don't know if I want to do this anymore. But we had to explain to her, my girl, the more you do it, the stronger your hands get. And the first time my son did climbs, he really enjoyed it, but now he's at a level where it's just too hard. And he's like, but Dad, I want to be the best right now. And we have, no, my boy, you have to struggle to get better each and every time. In the same way for each one of us, life is a struggle that you try and get better at each time to build that character. If we continually take the easy way out, we will never build that faith that is pure and that patience that can last, and ultimately our character will lack. And the most convicting part of this passage to me is what it says here in verse 4. Let perseverance finish this work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And so as God looks at it and as he speaks through James, it's the idea that at the end of your life, before you're about to meet Jesus, your faith lacks nothing. You have everything you need. And so as you approach Jesus at the judgment seat, it's the idea of Jesus, I lack nothing. I have lived my life well and fully for you. But with that, and what's difficult for me, is what then follows as he goes on. He speaks about doubt, but then he also speaks about this in verse 8. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all that they do. And then he says, believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wildflower. And so as he speaks to this group who are probably poor and struggling, he speaks to the idea of them, this is worth so much. Because in your poverty, your character will grow exponentially. But those who are rich, they need nothing. And so as they need nothing, They do not seek to grow in any way. Now, he's being extreme here. James is not saying to us that if you're rich, you're the worst individual on the planet and that you'll never grow. He is not saying that at all. But in the same way with Jesus, he is explaining the idea that if you're rich, it is harder in this life to grow in character. It takes effort. Whereas for the poor, yes, you lack, but you can grow in character. This goes against the prosperity gospel, and in fact goes against much of what we learn. To seek out to live humbly so that I can grow in character. I think often my problem in life is I don't think towards the future. I think about just the now. I don't think about what Dave will look like 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 30 years' time. I think about what I'll look like now. And so what I'm looking at now is I'm struggling now. I have difficulty now. Even for Michelle and I right now, we're having financial difficulties right now. And I'm not thinking about what is the character that will be built. I want it to be sorted out now. But what I need to start looking at it is like, Lord, what are you trying to build in the future? So that as Dave stands here in 30 years' time, what does that person look like? Is he a person who's a bit shinier, a little bit closer to reflecting Christ? Or is he still the same person who just wanted things sorted out now? We need to be people who start thinking more about our character and who we are and less about our circumstances. And that is so easy for me to preach and so hard to live. How do we do it? How do we actually start to live this out? How do I even take a step towards considering trials pure joy? Well, I think we need to start with this. First, we need to ask the question why we are going through a trial. What James is speaking about here is not just merely the idea of just, hey, just go through a trial, who cares? No, he wants you to ask the question. And so we need to ask the question to God, why? Why am I going through this, Lord? Am I going through this as a consequence of a sin that I have done? As a consequence of a sin of this world? Lord, help me to understand and to be better, to not fall into that trap. Or, Lord, am I going through this trial because of an act of righteousness? And so people are now persecuting me, or I'm suffering because of the good that is being done. Just because it's good doesn't mean good things will always follow. Why am I going through this, Lord? Once you've asked that why question, the next question that we then need to ask then is to ask for help. So notice what the passage speaks about in verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. And so the first place in which we ask for help is wisdom. God, give me wisdom. Here's a little bit of something that I've found convicting. When was the last time you wrote down something that was wise? Like really wrote it down and remembered it. Man, I write down a lot of nonsense. But when was the last time you wrote down something wise? We should write down the wisdom that God has already given us, things that we have already learned, and go, well, how do I learn from this? If you're continuously going through the same problems, it's quite possible that you haven't learned from the previous time. What are you going through? Ask for God's wisdom, and God will give us His wisdom through His Word. God can speak to us personally, or God can speak to us through the church. Ask for wisdom, but then remember that wisdom. And then this is the third part. You first ask questions. Why, Lord? Second, ask for help. And then third, remember how you've persevered in the past. All of us have persevered in small ways as believers. You've made one step. Remember that perseverance. But then also remember the perseverance that Jesus went through. If you think you've got it hard, remember what Jesus went through first. A man who didn't suffer because of any of his sin, but suffered purely because of righteousness' sake. He went through immense pain in his life as he saw followers walk away from him. He had hundreds of people following him at one stage, and hundreds of people left him. He has spoken about how you need to suffer. He has prophesied about what he is going to go through. And when he ultimately goes to the cross, to die at the cross for all the people, how many people of his followers are there? Almost none. One disciple and his mom and a few other ladies. The man who lived perfectly suffers for us, but he shows us perseverance. Let us learn from him in that way. As I started the sermon, I said, this is as comfortable as a mallet. You don't walk away from something like this going, man, that felt great. But what I can promise you is this. I can promise you that if you decide to take a step of perseverance, you decide, Lord, I'm going to seek you out when I go through trials. Lord, I'm not going to hide away from suffering, but I will embrace it in the sense of I can learn more about my God. I can promise you that the person that will come out of it at the end is a person who reflects Christ more. And that's a person that I think we all want to see. And I think that's a person we all want to be. I'm going to pray for us. And I imagine there are many people here who are going through difficulties. If you want us to pray for you, please come forward, and we're happy to pray for you in those difficulties. And as I said before, I'd love to pray that those difficulties go away, and that is a prayer that we can make to God. But at least for me, part of the prayer is also going to be, Lord, please help them in this, but also help them grow in character in this. Let us be people who grow in this faith. So how do we make this faith practical? We make it practical by living more like Jesus and going through suffering the way he did. Let me close in prayer. Father, I thank you for your word. And Father, I ask for forgiveness for just, especially in this sermon. For me as a preacher, this feels like a sermon that I talk the talk but don't walk the walk. I pray for myself personally that I would be a person who faces suffering and trials more like your disciples did, and ultimately more like your Son, Jesus Christ. Father, I do not wish for more suffering for any of us, but I also know suffering will come because your Son has promised it. I pray, Father, that I would be a person who grows in purity in my faith, who grows in perseverance, who grows in patience, and ultimately my character may look more like your Son, Jesus Christ. Father, for those who are sitting here right now, for those who are strong in the faith and yet are still going through suffering right now and struggles, I pray that they would seek your wisdom and that they would ask for help. Father, for those who are young in the faith and this seems like a teaching just too hard, I pray that you give them the strength necessary for them to face the next trial and for them to ask for help. And Father, for those here who do not yet know you, and as they hear this, they go, this is a sermon that's not for me. I don't like to hear about a Christ like this. I pray that they may be confronted by your Son, Jesus Christ, who loved them so much that he was willing to suffer for them so they too may have the crown of life. In his name, Jesus Christ, and by the power of your Holy Spirit.